Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's panel discussion on defining reparations in a Canadian context. This evening's panel discussion has been brought to you by the Afrocentric Learning Institute of Nova Scotia and also Afrocentricity International. We have an esteemed panel that has been assembled to have this rather interesting discussion on what reparations mean in a Canadian context. We know that there's been a lot of discussion about reparations in different parts of the world, in the US, in the Caribbean, in the UK, South America, etc. There's been conversations in Canada as well, but what does it mean when we think about the sort of chattel slavery that happened in the US that didn't take place over here? Per se, but nonetheless, there was slavery in Canada. So, what does reparations mean in a Canadian context? So, we'll have that discussion. Our three panelists, Sakaya Thomas, we will tell you a bit about him a little bit later. Dr. Isaac Saini and Vina Bernard are here in the studio and are ready to come on board. So, I'm going to bring them on board at this very moment. And here you guys are. Welcome, everyone. How's everybody doing?
Fine.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, we just have to make sure, Delvine, I'm not hearing you, so I have to unmute you. So there you go. Are you okay now?
Thank you very much. Happy to be here. Thank you, Mr. Moderator. All right, we're here.
Fantastic. So my name is Harvey Miller, and I will tell you a little bit about myself before I introduce the respective speakers. But just prior to coming on, we were having a discussion about the Nova Scotian elections. I think a lot of people were taken by surprise. Did you guys happen to be following that? Who was following the elections and who was actually surprised at the results? How do we explain it?
I think a number of people, I was following it, and I think a number of people were surprised by the results. Perhaps they didn't think the Liberals would win, but they didn't think they would suffer such a resounding defeat. And I think many of us who are in the Black community and people who are in general social justice struggles are worried about what this means, right? So, there are specific issues that will affect African Nova Scotians, specifically around initiatives around fighting anti-Black racism, the Justice Institute and a whole number of things, as well as general issues around social justice that will also affect the community. One of the key ones, as we see, is the fact that rent control, which was temporarily put on, is going to disappear at the end of September. What will this mean to this city, right? And I think people are worried about a backlash, right? A backlash, for example, against the issues about really truly establishing at least beginnings, if only cosmetic, of a beginnings of really addressing the issues of anti-Black racism and justice in general in the society. And of course, this is also taking place in the context of the fact that we're going to have a federal election on September 20th, right? And what will this mean as well? So my last point I'd make is there's been a lot of cosmetic activity, window dressing, and symbolic activity, which is important in and of itself, but not sufficient, because we want real material change, right? We want real change in the power relations, right, and distribution of resources. But even for some sectors of the ruling elite and societies, those symbolic gestures are unacceptable. Okay? They want their statues of Cornwallis. They want their statues of McGill, a slave trader, right? They don't want the history of slavery in Canada and segregation to be exposed. They want to maintain the convenient, conceited myth that Canada is this beautifully harmonious, multicultural mosaic.
That's a very interesting point. One of the things that comes to my mind when I reflect on the election, first of all, to say, I think that a lot of African Nova Scotians, psychologically remain a bit nonpartisan in the sense that, yes, we vote certain ways when it comes to big P politics, but we know that none of the parties have really ever done full service to what it is that we deserve. And they all have had a role in neglecting the issues of underdevelopment of the African Nova Scotian community. But at the same time, I think we also know that some parties have been better than others in terms of being in alignment with what it is that we truly need to have happen at the political level to right the wrongs and inequities that we face. But, I won't be long about this, but I'm kind of curious, and I know a lot of folks are worried about, and Isaac, you said it, worried about some things that have been started to move forward, and whether there'll be backlash, and whether the current ruling party will continue these things. But apart from concerns about who's in power right now, I think what troubles me most is what the election says about the Nova Scotian electorate. I had a cousin. We have these wonderful conversations when he calls, and he said to me, and so blunt. He said, Lavina, he said, the mainstream, and he'll be very, very clear. He goes, the white Nova Scotians have spoken. Those are his words. He said, they have spoken. I said, what do you mean? He said, that kind of a landslide win is basically people telling you that they're not happy with turning on their TV every day, hearing about Black Lives Matter. They're not happy hearing about appointments of Black people to key positions as deputy ministers in justice, deputy ministers in culture, or key positions in the Nova Scotia Public Service Commission or Human Rights Commission. They don't want to turn on their TV anymore and hear about seeing people in front of the television talking about what has happened to our First Nations sisters and brothers. They want it to go away. And they don't like, as he said, to see the complexion of Nova Scotia changing when you see people coming here from the Middle East and from Asia, India. When they walk in the stores, they don't want it. They want their simple world back. And they basically stated how clearly they want it back, no matter how good the Liberals did with the pandemic and how other governments have been rewarded. They voted based on they want to preserve the status quo or the old Nova Scotia and not willing to embrace change. Yeah. That just floored me when he said that. I think I was too busy to have thought of it. And I share that here now to say, whew, as he said, they want these statues.
One of the things you got to look at is the demographics of where you see the Liberal and the NDP vote. You see these largely in the urban region, and then you see a lot of the sort of a quote unquote outskirts or rural area around the province that actually has flipped their seats and so on. So and that seemed to mirror the kind of voting patterns that you see down south of the border too, right? Where in major urban centers like the Californias, the New Yorks, and so on, very much liberal minded and so on. But then as you get into these sort of states that are like in the deep south and so on, or out west, then you start to see the level of conservatism. So there seems to be some kind of a mirror, at least from the standpoint of this election, anyway.
Yeah.
And go ahead.
And I think there was one point we point as well, is that there wasn't that much difference between the Liberal vote and the Progressive Conservative vote in terms of numbers of people who voted, right? It's the nature of our first past the post system, right? Which is why proportional representation would probably do a lot. Also, the voter turnout was less than, I think, 55%, right? So there's a lot of people who did not vote, right? And of course, and one of the things that the PCs are very good at is sort of juxtaposing issues for struggles for social justice as somehow diminishing other aspects of people's lives, right? So they focused a lot on healthcare, and that's kind of ironic, right? It's progressive conservative governments that have pushed austerity budgets, as well as the Liberals, right? And I expect, we had McNeil's austerity, and will be followed by, the PC's austerity, right? But they were able to play up the problems with the healthcare system. And there's like cold words and so on, as if the Liberals concentrated too much on these kind of things around equity and diversity and social justice, as opposed to working on healthcare, as if healthcare isn't a social justice issue. And it's not a zero-sum game, right? So I'm concerned about these things, and I think talking about the election in the context of this broader discussion we're going to have about reparations are important, because at the end of the day, reparations, which is really about perhaps the most profound and the radical redressing of injustice, particularly as it comes to people of African descent, right, is a political issue. It really is a new political vision of society.
Excellent. And this is a great segue, opportunity to segue now into our panel discussion. So thank you very much for the discussion, the enlightenment around what has happened. I'm sure there'll be lots of kitchen conversations about what happened in this particular election, because there was a fair amount of surprise in that regard. So
I just got to get this last point in, which is it was quite ironic to focus on healthcare when you think of how the outgoing that the incoming government certainly did not in its tenure do anything to address healthcare either. So I just say that because that really is what won the day for them, was healthcare. And
right.
yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Divine. So we're going to start off, excuse me, our panel presentation just for the benefit of the audience. My name is Harvey Miller. I am the co-chair of the Afrocentric Learning Institute, along with Karen Hudson. And our mission is essentially to use Afrocentricity as a transformative philosophy around empowering our communities, particularly in the area of education and in community development, and social change, of course. We have Sakaya Thomas, who will start off the presentations, the various presentations. Each speaker will speak for approximately 8 to 10 minutes. And then I will introduce each speaker as I bring them up to speak. And then after that, we will have the floor open for question and answers. I want to tell those who are listening that you could actually post your questions in the chat. If you're watching on YouTube, you certainly can send us your questions there. If we will receive it. If you're watching on Facebook, then you can certainly send your questions there as well. And if you're sending, if you have comments that you want to make and you're watching on LinkedIn, you certainly can send your comments there as well. We will certainly pass it on to the panelists so that they could address your particular question at that point in time. So we're going to start off with Sakaya Thomas. Sakaya Thomas was an active participant at the United Nations World Congress Against Racism held in South Africa in 2001. In 2002, Sakaya was a key planner of the African and African Descendant World Conference Against Racism. The Global African Congress, GAC, was created out of that conference. Sakaya was elected its chair in 2002 and has continued in the role. The GAC strives to accomplish its goal of equitable distribution of global resources by demanding reparatory justice, advocating for policies that combat institutional racism, and working to ensure respect for all Africans everywhere. As chair of the GAC, Sakaya developed strategies to link with trade unions, youth, women, farmers, students, and professionals. Now organized in 20 nations, its constitution is considered by many to be a model for Pan-Africanism in the 21st century. So Sakaya, you have 8 to 10 minutes to share with us your thoughts on how we look at the issue of reparations in the Canadian context. What does that mean? We know that you're involved in conversations with many people around the globe. You just mentioned that there are 20 chapters around, or 20 nations have a similar chapter focusing on the issue. So in a Canadian context, what does that mean for us? So I'm going to turn the mic over to you.
Thank you very much, Harvey. And let me say thanks to the Afrocentric Learning. Well needed and timely discussion in Canada. Reparation in the Canadian context. I'll start off by saying that due to the breadth of diversity among many African descendants in Canada, the Canadian reparation movement must foster strong links among ourselves. We are required to recognize our differences. Increasing religious, ethnic, and cultural differences, which in many ways has been a source of strength to the Pan-African movement, also pose a challenge to the pursuit of common Pan-African causes such as reparation. For our reparation movement to succeed in Canada, these differences must be discussed, acknowledged, respected, and channeled adequately towards reconciling any differences that may arise in the reparation movement. What is reparation? Why? Reparation is the right The right to reparation has long been recognized in international law, has been defined by the Permanent Court of International Law, the predecessors of the International Court of Justice, defined in the following terms. The central principle contained in the actual notion is an illegal act, a principle which seems to be established by international practice, and in particular by the decision of arbitral tribunal, in that reparation must, as far as possible, wipe out all of the consequences of the illegal act and reestablish a situation which would, in all possibility, have existed if that act had not been committed. Restitution in kind, or if this is not possible, payment of a sum corresponding to the value which the institution in kind would bear. The reward, if needs be, of damage for loss sustained, which would not be covered by restitution in kind of payment. So in other words, I just tried to give a sense of how the International Court defined reparation. This definition applied to Canada. And it's important that we flush the thoughts out, because for a long time, a very long time, Canada have been hiding behind the underground railway, hiding behind this good humanitarian gesture, but it will not suffice for the crime of enslavement of African people. Denying the enslavement of African people, regardless, it's a crime against humanity, and for that reparation is due. So in Canada, we must develop a rationale why reparation is necessary. We must define the approach, and we must define the strategy. So reparation for the slave trade and enslavement is a crime, and among the most important, a substantive issue in the Black world today. African Canadian must get justice and play a role in this global justice movement. Second point, reparation is a necessary first step in repairing and healing the appalling damage done to Africa and its descendants by European powers, including Canada and the United States of America. As African people, we must trace the origin of the enslavement of Africans and characterize it in its proper historical context. And we are pleased, in many respects, to see the outstanding work that is being done by our academic like Professor Hilary Beckles, University of Western Vernon Shepherd, Michelle Johnson Cannon, our very own Isaac Sase in Canada, and our upcoming giants such as our dear sister Delvina. We must also examine Canada and the transatlantic slave trade connectivity, and why is it an urgent task. The need for continuous research and discourse on Canada connectivity, the Atlantic Triangle slave trade, that is the plantations in the Caribbean, where producing valuable cash crops such as sugar, molasses, cotton, and tobacco, and where the Canadian ports like St. John, Canadian and US port like St. John's, we must continue to do qualitative and quantitative research to illustrate the extent and degree of Canadian participation in the enslavement of African people. We must continue to explore Canada's links to the institution of slavery through its history of international trade, that is, sugar from the Caribbean to Canada, as well as we could look at salt, cod, and timber in exchange for these goods in the Caribbean. We must also take an in-depth look at the establishment of Canadian banks that was directly linked to the enslavement of African people in the Caribbean. Some of the first known well-established Canadian banks, is directly linked to the enslavement of African people. We need to explore those kind of linkages and see the extent to which Canada at these institutions should be held accountable for their role in the enslavement of African people. Need for better understanding of the institutionalized anti-Black and African racism, which was developed to justify slavery, and the legacy of its lingering effect, racial injustice, the racial gap from economics, political, and cultural perspective. These are works that reparation activists in Canada must actively engage in order to have a qualitative distinction around these issues. Canada is uniquely positioned to play a critical role in the global mass movement for reparation, which is one of the big demands. To do this, we must face our challenge and encourage productive dialogue between the historical Black communities and the later arrivals. Canadian reparation movement must define its working relationship and determine what it must look like if we are going to achieve our mission. Unity is our strength, division is our weakness. The Canadian reparation movement cannot be Alberta versus Ontario, British Columbia versus Quebec, Newfoundland versus Nova Scotia. We all came on the same slave ship, dropped off in Barbados or Brazil, and make our way across the Americas. I am therefore recommending that we start the process of looking at building bridges between Africans and the continent and across the diaspora, building an effective platform to learn from each other, about each other, and advance the cause of the reparation campaign across Canada and the global African communities. Undertake effective mass educational program like the Afrocentric Learning Institute, campaign on reparation in Canada and the larger diaspora using popular accessibility media, music, storytelling, film, and discussion like we're having. That's my remarks, opening remarks for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sakaya. Much appreciated. We will sort of save the questions for after the speeches or the presentations, and I'm making some notes to do some follow up with you after you've spoken. Just for the folks who are listening, if you do want to send some questions based on what you've heard, please feel free to do that by using the comments in the on YouTube comment section, or comment section on Facebook or on LinkedIn, and we will get your questions and we'll pass it on to the panelists. The second speaker that we have for you today is none other than Miss Delvina Bernard. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about Delvina before she gets started. Delvina Bernard is a sixth-generation African-Canadian from Nova Scotia who traces her Canadian ancestry to the Black Royal Empire Loyalists of 1783 and the Black refugees of 1812. She's an educator, human rights activist, singer, songwriter, and is an institutional change strategist. For nearly 2 decades, she served as executive director of the Policy Council with the Nova Scotia Department of Education, where her work focused on redressing inequities for Black learners. Currently, she's the Equity, Diversity, Inclusion, and Accessibility Advisor to the President of Mount St. Vincent University. Delvina is a founding member of numerous organizations in the education, performing arts, and community economic development sectors. Most notably, she is a founding member of the Afrocentric Learning Institute of Nova Scotia, and she is a Canadian representative, or the Canadian representative of Afrocentricity International, which is a global Pan-African organization dedicated to the elevation of an African consciousness, founded by Dr. Molefi Kete Asante and Dr. Ama Mazama. Delvina is the co-editor of the book Theorizing Afrocentricity in Action, which chronicles the experiences of Black adult educators in Nova Scotia. She's also a PhD candidate at St. Mary's University in Halifax, The dissertation examines reparations as a development strategy to overcome the legacy of enslavement, colonization, and cultural genocide. Delvina Burnett, you have the floor for 8 to 10 minutes.
Thank you, Harvey. Good evening, everybody. I just want to say that my thesis work, none other than Mr. Isaac Saini, Dr. Isaac Saini, is one of the leaders of my committee, co-coordinators, thesis supervisors. And so my thesis will be good if he's really there behind me, and I know he is. So I know how to pick them. I know how to pick the good ones. So I'm going to share 3 perspectives about reparations in Canada, and I'm going to use an African Nova Scotian lens to highlight my points, and not just because I'm here in Nova Scotia, because that's not the main reason. But Nova Scotia is a historic mecca and genesis of the Black experience in Canada. So I'm hoping that what I will say will resonate with people elsewhere in Canada. And even though the population of Blacks in Nova Scotia we know it's smaller than what you would see in Ontario and Quebec, even Alberta and British Columbia. And even Manitoba has a larger population. But Nova Scotia is home to the oldest Black communities in this country and the largest community of Indigenous Blacks who have been here since the mid 1700s. But before I get really into the 3 points that I just want to offer like a bit of a definition. I want to build on what Sakaya already mentioned in terms of the United Nations definition, World Court definitions. And it talks about reparations as really being something that is offered as repair to victims of gross violations of international human rights. And it recommends that any kind of reparatory justice settlement ought to include restitution, rehabilitation, satisfaction, non-repetition, or guarantees of non-repetition, so that what has happened isn't repeated again, just in a more modern way, and compensation. So those are the core elements. But when we talk about reparations in the Canadian context, there's some really interesting nuances. And in some ways, some would say it's even complicated when we look at the historical story, because we in Canada were victims of what happened by the French, the English, but because most of us here, for instance, in Nova Scotia, and many in Ontario also, were under enslavement in the US before coming here either through the Black loyalists or the Black refugees or through the Underground Railroad, there's also culpability by the United States. And then what about once we got here and all of the promises that were broken? So then there's Canada. So you got France, you got England, you got the US, you got Canada. So all of these factor into how we really define reparations in the Canadian context and how it fans out to these. So the 3 sort of ideas I want to share, I've kind of put them in the form of 3 questions. And the 3 questions are, first of all, 1, what are the factors that have kind of propelled the current Canadian reparations debate? Like, what has happened that has drawn us in? What are the key things that is raising this awareness? The second question I have is, even though Canada is an economically affluent country, and we have to ask the question, is there a need for an alternative economic development lens when we talk about reparations? Because Sakaya talked about, the banks and all these other institutions that are culpable. And so, we have to always have the economic development conversation when we talk about reparations. And then my question around that is that, do we need an alternate economic lens when we're talking about exploring reparations in Canada? The third question is there a need to adopt a theoretical framework to guide reparations philosophy, reparations research, and reparations strategies and projects? So those are the 3 questions I hope to get to. I'm going to kind of shorten it up, and hopefully some of this might come out when we have the discussion. So when I look at the first question, is like, what are some of the factors that have propelled us? And I kind of named about 4 or 5 things, and I'm just going to put them out there. Is that Sakaya talked about the Durban Conference on Anti-Racism, and some of the increased attention here, for instance, in Nova Scotia, can be traced directly to participation in that 2001 UN World Conference on Anti-Racism in Durban by a few key African Nova Scotians who attended that, who were some key influencers or academics and social justice people. And I think for many of us, that's where the conversation started to come into focus, when people were saying, what is this reparations we're talking about? What does it even mean? So I think being a part of that delegation and vanguard of Canadians that went to that conference, I think sort of tipped people towards, like, perhaps there's something here that we need to start talking about. Then, as we know, Sakaya is, the chair of the Global African Congress. But of course, the actual establishment of the Global African Congress and having people here in Nova Scotia who are part of that, who are members of that, and who are leading work here, even in Nova Scotia, as part of the philosophy under the banner of the Global African Congress, has also created a growing presence of the issue of reparations here. And also, even that, here locally, the GAC has even played a key part in helping a lot of people to even explore parallel current day issues such as neocolonialism, what's happening in terms of indigenous genocide, anti-Black racism. So this is also elevating our consciousness overall. A third factor that has gotten us going is DPAT, this whole decade of people of African descent. It has, given us many opportunities. It has heightened the interests of African Nova Scotians to explore a lot of the tenets of reparatory justice as a liberatory strategy. Exponential growth and explosion of information about African people because of the UN decade is also, I think, a key factor contributing to our jumping into the global debate and global discourse on reparatory justice. The CARICOM, the Caribbean Commission on Reparations. I think this is an important catalyst. It's becoming increasingly influential in elevating the reparations debate in Nova Scotia. And that's because a number of individuals, academics, grassroots people, community philosophers, and social justice activists are in constant conversation with people leading the Caribbean reparations movement. And I think that cross-fertilization is great. That's what I love about Nova Scotia, where there's a little place off the beaten track, but we seem to somehow plug into what's happening internationally, and we always seem to, get our consciousness raised at the same time and jumping into these conversations. We can't ignore what has been happening to the south of us in terms of the United States congressional hearings on Bill H.R. 40, which for years congressmen worked so hard to try and get the government of the United States to appoint a commission to discuss reparations in the United States. And so recently, as we saw that these conversations have elevated to the point where progress is being made. We watch a lot of American TV, and it became like kitchen talk among a lot of people in Nova Scotia about reparations because of them watching what was happening in the United States. And lastly, I can't leave out Africville, the community of Africville, which was raised to the ground in the 1960s and into 1970s. Also a critical factor. The Africville community and many of its leaders and activists and et cetera have been some of the first people to start articulating the fact that they needed to have some kind of repair for what happened to them in losing their community, how it impacted their history, how it impacted their economics, how it impacted, their self-esteem, everything about them. So in that case of Africville, it's not just of national level profile and awareness, but it's international. The UN special commission that came here to Canada to look at Canada talked about Africville and criticized, Nova Scotia for what it did to the people of Africville, and says it deserves compensation for this. So I think this is all connected. So the second question is, even though Canada is an economically affluent country, do we need to have an alternative economic model when we try to explore reparations? And I think the short answer to that is yes. And here's what I mean. I think by all standards and indices, Canada is considered to be economically and socially at the top of its class. But Canada is a capitalist country with an economy that is largely driven by private enterprise and free market. And the overall standard of living, as far as access to healthcare, education, all these things are great. And Canada ranks from the highest in the world. But the question then becomes, are Black Canadians equally represented in these good news statistics and these good news indices? And I think the answer is we are not. The majority of Canadians, though, however, accept the current system at face value. We don't question the status quo. Instead, we're all, even us Black folk, trying to figure out how to get more for our individual selves within the current system. So therefore, we have to ask the question, does the Canadian economic system work for Black Canadians? Is our current economic system structured in a way that can easily allow us as descendants of former enslaved people to catch up with the descendants of former slave owners? How can reparation strategies help us Black Canadians achieve economic justice if we accept the system the way it is? Obviously, it didn't work for us. It wasn't built with us in mind. We were the labor to help build it. So every day, we hear report after report about showing the wealth gap between Blacks and whites and others in this country. And we see reports that document the impact of intergenerational wealth in maintaining and widening that gap. So as we in Canada set out to explore the issue of reparatory justice and in the economic sense, we have to be prepared to not just only put slavery on trial, but to put capitalism on trial. We must prepare ourselves to make the case that our precious Canadian economy has to answer for itself and how it became that way, and their participation in the slave trade, as Sakaya said. We need to be more forceful in exposing the fact that the current economic underdevelopment of African Canadians is a legacy of enslavement, colonialism, systemic economic neglect, all of which has been fueled by the political economy of capitalist development. Therefore, the Canadian Canadian underdevelopment has to be understood as a feature of its unique economic history. And not by sort of some of the things that we say, like a deficit. We blame a lot of things on, the public school system is why we're not ahead, or racist employers is why we're not ahead, or the police officers, or all these other, but it's bigger than that. We know that. We have to put capitalism on trial. We must put capitalism on trial as we seek to discover what reparations means for us in Canada. So my last question is there a need to adopt a theoretical approach or framework to sort of center us or undergird reparations philosophy and reparations research or strategies? Again, I think the short answer to that question is yes. Because I'm afraid that if we don't have a solid philosophical framework for ongoing reparations research and strategies and proposals, we'll just revert to what it is that we know. And what is the question? What is it that we know? We know how to do things in a Eurocentric context. This is what we're taught every day in both formal and informal ways, through formal curriculum, informal curriculum. Our values, our customs, our beliefs, and worldview, we know that they are under siege every day in Canada. Black communities in Nova Scotia are disappearing. Our churches are closing. Our land is being encroached upon by developers and speculators. And of course, our schools disappeared long ago in the 60s because we sort of misunderstood what the desegregation movement should lead on. So I just say we need to face the fact that Blacks in Canada, even though we make up 3% of the population, just like, say, our French and the Francophone sisters and brothers, I think we live in fear of cultural assimilation and disappearance. So we struggle every day to maintain our African ways of being and doing and knowing, and we're fighting to keep our culture alive. So then we need to have that as a part of the conversation for reparations. Many African Nova Scotians believe that reparatory justice, and I think all of us believe that reparatory justice is an opportunity to reset the cultural clock and turn back the dial and reclaim and protect and preserve our cultural way of life. So reparatory justice can be a pipeline to a prosperous future. But in order for that to happen, I believe we have to have an underlying philosophical framework that distinguishes us as a unique cultural group in Canada. Otherwise, any gains that we make through any kind of reparatory compensation will just go straight back into the mainstream capitalist coffers. And also increase access to social institutions gained through reparatory justice might just result in the abandonment of our own community because we become so assimilated into the mainstream community. And if not guided by a solid philosophical framework that opens access to mainstream, if not guided by a solid philosophical framework, we could just end up being a part of the mainstream, being a part of that. And that's a massive brain drain to our community. So I think that reparatory justice must be grounded in a philosophy of social change, which emphasizes the worldview of African people in the Americas, the Caribbean, the diaspora, and the whole. And reparatory justice must involve the systemic exploration of relationships, be they social, cultural, political, economic, or spiritual, that put African people at the center. And for that, for me, there's only one word for it now that I said it, and that's Afrocentricity. Reparations must acknowledge that African people that we've been decentered, placed on the peripheral of European history, experiences, and narratives, and all reparations research programs must focus. Let me just read that right. And all reparations research programs must focus. That doesn't make a lot of sense. Yeah, that it must focus on an Afrocentric perspective. I think that's what I wanted to say. So we must be key players. The theory becomes, by virtue, an authentic relationship to the centrality of the African experience. And I think Afrocentricity is the one thing that offers that. And as I look around a bit too, at some of the various, like the United States now even has a 10-point plan in some of the organizations. The CARICOM has a 10-point plan. And those are very good. Although I don't see an underlying theoretical framework that is coached in or grounded strongly in Afrocentric theory and philosophy. So we need to do that. And so we absolutely need to do that. And I'll stop here. That Afrocentricity has to be our underlying philosophical.
Yeah. I do believe that there will be great opportunity for a discussion on that. What should that sort of philosophical framework look like? Afrocentricity is certainly one transformative model that could be considered. I'm sure maybe others may have slightly different or new approaches to that. So we will leave that part for some discussion afterwards. I think that will make a very healthy discussion on the philosophical ground, because I do believe, yes, if we don't have that sort of philosophical framework, then reparations may not be guided sufficiently in our own interest. Our last but not least speaker is Dr. Isaac Saini. Dr. Isaac Saini has taught in the transition year program for over 20 years. He holds a PhD in history from the School of Oriental and African Studies from the University of London in the United Kingdom. SOAS is recognized as one of the world's premier centers for the study of Africa. His dissertation focuses on the intersection of Cuban and Southern African history. His teaching has encompassed courses on Africa, the Caribbean, Cuba, and Black Canadian history. He is the author of the widely acclaimed book, Cuba, A Revolution in Motion, published by London, Z Books. So published in London by Z Books in 2004. He's also an adjunct professor in history at St. Mary's University. His teaching and scholarship encompasses Africa, the Caribbean, the U.S. civil rights movement, and Cuba, and Black Nova Scotian history. He's also a recipient of the Dalhousie President's Award for the Advancement of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusiveness. His roots lie in the Black Nova Scotian community and the Caribbean. Dr. Saini, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you for having me. I think we've had two very rich presentations. First of all, I think, I'd like to sort of begin by sort of deviating from my notes and talking a little bit about what Delvina had mentioned, which is this philosophical framework to undergird reparations. I think quite often people conceive reparations in sort of a very crude way as some sort of monetary payment out to Black communities, and then the debate goes on who will receive those payments, in what form will they be received, and so forth. But I think it's important to understand that what undergirds reparations is a very profound philosophical understanding of a way the world should be restructured. It's about transforming the social relations that exist in the world. In the same way that people sort of misunderstand what decolonization means. Decolonization and reparations do not mean depriving and stealing wealth from people of European ancestry. It means transforming the social relations in such a way that not only will the burden of oppression and disenfranchisement and marginalization that have basically, in a sense, weighed down the African communities that exist in Canada and elsewhere, that these things will be eliminated, but it will also transform social relations in such a way that the lives of all will be improved. So I think that's one way of looking at reparations. Hilary Beckles recently in a conference organized by the Global Action Congress with its Toronto chapter sort of really underscored this point. And what he spoke about really, which was very profound, was as we face an ecological catastrophe, anyone who's read the recent intergovernment panel report on global climate change understands two things. One, that we're facing an ecological crisis, a disaster, a cataclysm. The very existence of the human species will be called into question. And that communities of color, particularly people of African descent, within the diaspora, whether that's within the Americas as a whole, or people who live on the continent, right, will be the ones who will bear the greatest brunt of this. And by transforming the relationship between people of African descent, okay, and the economic and world structures that exist, we will transform the world in such a way that we can make it livable for human beings. And I think that's a critical point to understand. People often crudely reduce, as I've said before, reparations simply to this idea of some sort of monetary arrangement, right? And as Beckles pointed out, it's not simply you give us money and then you go away. It's about a partnership to transform the world, right? And for those of us who have children, those of us who have grandchildren, those of us who may not have children or grandchildren, but look at the way the world is unfolding, we know the world is in need of dire and very radical change. And reparations is both a movement to transform these conditions, but also a way of transforming how we view the world. I think that's important. Reparations itself, as Delvina pointed out, and as Sakaya, the reason why reparations resound so much with people of African descent is because of the current present conditions that people live in. I don't specifically need to go through the litany, right, of all the indicators that have demonstrated that when you look at housing, healthcare, income, and so forth, people of African descent, right, often are at the bottom of that ladder. I mean, Marcus Garvey, when he traveled through Central America, right, right? He often pointed out that where he went, basically people of African descent were always back at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder. And he attempted to explain why this happened, right? Of course, it has to do with the centrality, as people pointed out, of slavery and colonialism in making and shaping the world we inhabit today. The depredations, injustice, and inequalities that flow from this history provide both the legal and moral grounds that establish the necessity for reparations. Sakaya has done a fantastic job in saying that reparations is a deeply embedded concept in both international law and domestic law. There are numerous cases of reparations that have been established. And on the specific case of reparations for indigenous genocide in the Caribbean and for the mass African enslavement, those cases that are going forward, right, are going to transform, I think, the legal terrain when people go to struggle for social justice. But I think an important point to bear in mind as well is in September, we will be marking the 20th anniversary of September 11th. Okay, what people forget is that before September 11th, as was spoken about by Sakaya and by Delvina, there was in August and early September, the United Nations World Conference Against Racism, Xenophobia, and Other Related Intolerance, UNWCAR for short. This was a major international event. And at the center of this, there were a number of issues, right? But one of the central issues was the demand for reparations and the fact that the West was defeated on this issue. This conference wasn't news that was carried in the middle pages of the newspapers. It was front page news. And the United States, Britain, and Canada walked out of that conference, right? But because they had been marginalized and defeated. And so reparations and this idea of, in a sense, redressing the fundamental dehumanization and disfranchisement of African people, not only in the continent of Africa due to colonization, but in the diaspora because of enslavement and the consequential desegregation and Jim Crowing of those communities, that they had been, the retribution and compensation to address those things had been agreed as a necessary step at that conference. And the West was defeated on that issue. And they walked out. And it was a huge defeat. At that time, before 9/11, it was an unprecedented defeat for the West. And then 9/11 happened and transformed geopolitics. And reparations receded. But now we see the movement returning again, okay? And so one of the fundamental issues that really places reparations, as I said, on this issue is that reparations speaks not to the past, it speaks to the future. It speaks, yes, first and foremost to communities of African descent, but it speaks to all of humanity. Black liberation and authentic Black emancipation has not just simply been a project about a Black advancement and the end of Black oppression. It's always encompassed the struggle for all of human liberation. When we look at the Haitian Revolution of 1791, when the more than 500,000 enslaved Africans rose and overthrew the French and established the first independent Black republic in the Americas, right? They saw themselves not only engaged in an African liberation project, but also saw themselves as part and parcel of the anti-colonial struggles raging through Latin America. So Simon Bolivar, for example, not only found refuge in Haiti, but diplomatic and material support. So reparations is not only about, very importantly, acknowledging this history, okay, of enslavement, of brutalization, and the consequential as the disenfranchisement that unfolds. It's a vision of the future. It's a vision of society that's fundamentally just. It's a vision of justice, not just for people of African descent, but for all human beings. And within this, we have the question of Canada. It's been pointed out quite clearly by Sakaya that we have various divisions and ethnicities among the people of African descent in Canada. In fact, Canada has often been described as the most fractured African diasporic community in the Americas, right? But that being said, okay, there's a fundamental commonality that unites these struggles, despite what differences that might exist. Canada often likes to pretend that it was, in a sense, a passive and disinterested viewer of the transatlantic slave system. But as we know, chattel slavery existed in Canada. Africans were sold, and a whole precedent was established in which Africans were not only treated as a source of cheap labor, readily available cheap labor, but also treated as non-citizens, in which their political and social rights were steadily circumscribed. We also know that Canada itself was directly tied into the financial, as Sakaya pointed out, the financial circuits of the slave trade and investment in the plantations. For example, there's in Halifax, there were a number of people like Captain John Gorman. There was a naval captain Bloss and others who were involved in financing slaving ships. We know about the trade between of salt cod to the Caribbean for rum and molasses, right? We also know, for example, that Dalhousie University was 30% of the funds used to found the university that I teach at came from monies that were earned, right, in the transatlantic slave trade, in investments in the plantation economies. So we know that Canada is intimately entwined in here. But we also know that emerging from the transatlantic slave trade system and slavery in Canada was a constellation of values, practices, and dynamics that shaped the historical trajectory of communities of people of African descent who may have arrived here as normally free men and women. The Black loyalists, the Black refugees, and other migrations to other parts of Canada, whether to Southern Ontario and whether to out west. And this profoundly shaped the experience of these people of African descent. So slavery is not just simply about past practice. It's not just simply about the wealth that was made, even though we know there were banks that were founded in Canada directly tied to Islam and slave trade. It's about how the historical trajectory of people of African descent was shaped. The idea that the claim of people of African descent for citizenship in Canada is problematic comes directly out of the system of slavery that existed here. The idea that even though people arrived as free men and women, the precedent had already been set to see them as bereft of political rights and bereft of claims on citizenship rights. I think both Sakaya and Delvina have done a very good case in tracing out how we would make a case for reparations, the framework for a case for reparations, based on the existence of slavery in Canada and the consequences, right? But I think one of the key things that we have to think about as well is state complicity. The colonial state in the Canadas and what was to become Canada was complicit deliberately and consciously in not only enslavement of Africans, but then their marginalization and disfranchisement of other communities of African people up into the 20th century. So they stayed complicitly in this. There's also the fact that the Canadian Constitution, right, needs to be rewritten. It's a constitution that was promulgated in 1867 based on the myth of two founding people, and since then has not really acknowledged the fact that people of African descent have played a fundamental role here in Canada. So constitutional change is necessary, right? And I am one of these people who believes that a constitution written in the 18th century, as in the U.S. Constitution, or a constitution written in 1867, like the Canadian Constitution, even though it had a Charter of Rights and Freedom added in 1982, is not fit to actually run a society in 2021. Things change, people's values change, right? And conditions change. And I think one of the things that we would need, in a sense, as Delvina spoke about, to this radical philosophy, and this radical philosophy is about transforming the social and economic relations that we live in, to create a more just society, a more just redistribution of resources, and understanding that there have been communities that have been deliberately disadvantaged, deliberately disenfranchised, deliberately marginalized, deliberately pushed to the sidelines of society, right? Okay, that requires significant investments, right? And more importantly, societies that require the fact that they be giving an authentic and a real right of self-determination to determine how they should develop their societies. At the beginning of our broadcast, we began with an informal discussion about the elections, right? And we talked about, the fact of, a backlash. We talked about the fact that have Nova Scotians really spoken. One of the things that has stood out for me in the recent years, particularly with the passing of the great Dr. Burley Rocky Jones, is the lack of independent Black politics. So when we think of reparations for me, it not only involves this kind of resource allocation, right, to redress the inequities, this reparation, this restitution that's required. It not only means the transformation of the social relations that are involved, it means giving to allowing the African Nova Scotian community the political right of self-determination to determine how Okay, whatever reparations that emerge, how that is done in not only in Nova Scotia, but in Ontario, but in the rest of Canada. So it's a political project. And as I said at the beginning, it's a project that looks not just to the past, but it looks to the future. And as I've said before, and I said in a previous broadcast dealing with Emancipation Day, what emancipation means, what true reparation means, is liberation not only for people of African descent, but a transformation of society that will benefit all of humanity. Now, I had actually scripted my comments, but they were anticipated by both Sakaya and Delvina. We all know we're living in the International Decade of People of African Descent. We all know that Canada tries to pretend that slavery didn't exist and somehow is exempt from the case for reparations. It doesn't make sense here. They would like to argue Canada is some sort of harmonious multicultural mosaic. We also know that within Canada, there's this idea that somehow colonialism in Canada was a gentle colonialism with a human face. The discovery of the hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of residential school graves, right? And the continual extent of anti-Black racism and violence against people of African descent, historically and contemporarily, basically exposed the lie and the poverty of that kind of argument and vision of Canada. Reparations, I think, is obviously a question that will involve bringing all the communities of people of African descent to Canada. I am a Pan-Africanist who can also appreciate that there are distinctiveness between particular groups. But I think understanding reparations in Canada is not only an understanding of the existence of chattel slavery here. It's not only an understanding of how the Canadian state and Canadian ruling elites were entwined in the transatlantic slave system, but it's also an understanding that slavery itself shaped the segregation, shaped the disenfranchisement that continues to impact and burden communities of African descent in Canada today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Isaac. And thanks to all of you for the very profound exposés that you've delivered. Give us a lot to think about when we think about reparations. Each of you talked about so many things. I was trying to make some notes. I'm not sure I could even paraphrase a lot of what was said, but I know that one of the important things that stood out for me in Sakaya's presentation was the notion that when we address reparations, that we cannot do this in a fractured way, that essentially we have to build bridges between the various communities within the diaspora. And one of the ways that it would appear that we need to build those bridges is that we have to develop a common understanding of what reparations actually mean. Because if new immigrants see reparations as something very different from, say, indigenous African Canadians and so on, then it is difficult to bring them together so that they could actually advocate for change and for reparations on behalf of all African people. So absolutely, that's necessary. Devine talked about these 3 points in terms of talking about factors, in terms that has sort of created that increased awareness of reparations. One of the other questions that she talked about, or points that she raised, had to do with is there a philosophical is there a need for a philosophical framework for addressing how we actually go about not only demanding reparations, but what we do if we in fact are able to be successful at getting reparations? Then what is this sort of philosophical construct that will guide what we do as we seek reparations? And then is there a need for an alternative economic system because of the fact that Canada is a capitalist country and we do not want to simply replicate what already exists? Isaac talked about several factors, several points. One of the ones that sort of triggered the thought in my mind about the idea of true Black liberation and reparations, and the relationship between those two things. It sort of begs the question whether or not we could actually have true emancipation without reparations, and how those two things are supposed to sort of work hand in hand. We have to acknowledge that while Canada like to pretend that, we often talk about we're politely racist, that it was a sort of passive bystander in terms of the Atlantic slave trade, but it played a critical role, particularly in terms of providing finance and resources to fuel or to support the slave trade. So these are just some of the nuggets that picked out of your presentations. There was a whole lot more that was actually said. So now we want to open the floor to some questions from the audience, but I also have some in case we don't see any questions coming in. We do have a number of people who have joined us, and thank you everyone for joining this conversation. This conversation is happening in many quadrants around the world, and we're sort of hearing the clarion call for more and more of these conversations to take place. But we need to understand what we mean by reparations and not get into the sort of reductionist approach that Isaac talked about, that seen it largely in terms of monetary repayment for all the atrocities that were meted out to people of African descent. So while we're waiting for some questions, let me see if I see any questions gonna come in here. Let's see, do we have any questions? Anyone want to ask a question, please go ahead and do so. But I'm going to pose a question I'm going to mute everybody's mics and pose a question. Actually, I have a couple of questions here, but one of the questions I want to ask, which is not on my list of determined questions, is that whole issue about that kind of ties into what Delvana talked about in terms of us as a distinct people, number one, a distinct culture, to emancipation, and then reparations. I'm wondering, because a lot of the progress that has been, that we tend to believe that has been made, and Isaac, I think you alluded to that in our sort of a pre-discussion, that a lot of window dressing has happened. People see, new deputy ministers. People are seeing a number of positions in equity, diversity, and inclusion, and all those sorts of things that seem to be a bit of some window dressing. If we want true liberation, how do we use reparations as a way of catalyzing true emancipation? Canada is now officially acknowledging Emancipation Day, but how do we use reparations to allow us to build that sense of independence, self-determination, having this sort of political independence? So I throw that out to you in terms of to all three of you, the relationship between reparations and true emancipation. Who wants to go first?
I think our mics are muted.
No, you're not muted. I'm hearing you.
Oh, well, I'll defer to Sakaya. Go in that order.
Okay. I don't think there's a distinction between emancipation and reparation. In a sense, we have not yet won our emancipation battle. So in that sense, we have to see it as stages. We have to see what our ancestors did and why they did it and how far they got, and why it's incumbent upon us that this generation decided to carry on with the battle. So for me, I think get to that point where we could look at reparation. We have to look at, as Isaac indicated, reparation is about transformation, is about transforming a relationship, is about transforming the social relationship. And Delvina currently pointed out that we must look at the links between enslavement, slave trade, and capitalism. And can we have reparation and go back to this model of economic organization and social organization that continued the exploitation of man by man, woman by man by woman, and so on and so forth. So reparation is about transformations, transforming the social relationship in society, how we see each other. Another critical part of the reparation movement in Canada, for example, that I think will be uniquely Canadian, is that the history of African people in Canada, there's a lot of work that still has to be done around that. And that is because we essentially have been written out of the history books. You know, it was not coincidental or accidental. It's by design as part of the institutionalization of racism and to dehumanize us that we've been written out of the history book. And so that's a critical part of the reparation and emancipation journey that we must get back. We must find a situation where the society could begin to look at the past and that we begin to tell our own story from our own perspective, our own interpretation of it, and not be defined by others. It is precisely this exclusion from our history why we find that institutionalized anti-Black racism is so prevalent and it's so easy and it's so accessible to everybody else that they could engage in anti-Black racism against every single one of us, regardless of where we're located in this country.
Okay, thank you for that. Just before the next person chimes in on this, I'm just wondering, can we even truly achieve emancipation, given where we are in terms of our economic status, our social status, and all those things? Can we truly even achieve full emancipation without reparations? Davina or Isaac, who's going there?
Well, I was one of the things that I think that is unfortunately marked, and I'm sort of drawing on what James Baldwin has always said, right? The struggle is asserting African humanity, the humanity of black people.
Yes.
And when we start, one of the things why reparation resonates so much with people is, as people have said here already before, is the condition of communities of people of African descent at the present. When we look at, for example, the COVID pandemic, it's people of color, particularly people of African descent, who are dying in the greatest numbers, who are the most vulnerable and who are ignored. So there's actually, a racial component to it, what people like to refer to as, racial capitalism and COVID. When we look at Africa, maybe 1% or less than 1% of Africans have been vaccinated, and there seems to be very little concern, right, for African life. There are also articles that talk about the ecological disaster that faces us that actually sees Africa as a potential threat. There were articles that appeared in the Global Mail that saw Africa as a few years ago as an ecological threat. So one of the things about reparations, as Sakaya was pointing out, is it helps highlight this history of dehumanization and disenfranchisement, right? And it also reestablishes the African claim, both in the diaspora and on the continent, because I think it's important that quite often we talk about the transatlantic slave system. It comes to more or less an end, and then we talk about the colonization and division of Africa, right? Both of them should actually be seen as different phases of the denial of the humanity of Africans, or people of African descent. And so what often happens, right, in terms of all of this, right, okay, as we go through this whole struggle here, is that reparations, really places the idea of Africa, of the African claim for justice, okay, on the map. It exposes this history, because if you're going to talk about reparations, you have to talk about this history, and it's very and you have to expose it in that sense, right? I think that reparations and emancipations, whatever you see their relationship, either emancipation is part of reparations or reparations is part of emancipation. Obviously something has to be done to redress the conditions, right, in which people live, and to make a contribution to these historical inequities. But I think at the end of the day, the centrality of the transatlantic slave trade and slave system to building capitalism, right, which is destroying the planet, okay, it hasn't necessarily be changed. That it has to be eliminated, right? What we mean by that, new social relations have to be put in place.
Okay, thank you for that. Giovanna, I don't know if you want to chime in. We have a few questions.
Yeah. Oh, just very quickly. Yeah, very quickly, I will say, I mean, they're so inextricably linked, emancipation and reparations, because when we think about it, reparations is really about finishing the work we started. It's about finishing the work. We know that, I always like to look at it in like 3 tiers, in the sense that our first real collective sort of resistance to what happened to us after the transatlantic slave trade was fighting to receive our freedom in terms of being able to have domain over our own bodies. So that first one was bringing slavery to an end in British North America in 1834. That was the first tier of the work. But that was, we got that freedom and we called it emancipation, but we were not emancipated. We know that we were not. So we just got control of our bodies. The second phase, I think if I look through history, is the period of time when African people in the diaspora were saying, we want to have control of our domains where we are. So what that looked like in the Caribbean was like the whole independence movement, and in Africa, the whole independence movement, and how that looked for us over here, because we didn't own countries, was a complete rights revolution. But like Isaac has said also, we didn't always just do these things for ourselves. When you look at the 60s and the whole rights revolution and onward, look at all of the kind of rights revolution organizations that piggybacked on what we did, that we took those risks in terms of like the, gender rights, women's rights, or whether it was, LGBTQ rights. Some of those people marched so strong with us Black people and where they are today, anti-war movement, anti-poverty. So we were really, at that point, I think, fighting to have equality within the system that existed, within the system that existed. But reparatory justice is coming to finish the work, in the sense that the first time we got control of our bodies, the second term we're fighting for rights within the existing system. This time we're having a bigger conversation. And the conversation we're having this time is that we want to change the very system itself so that we can have more equality, not just equality, but equity and a more social justice frame of how we live in the world. And that is very different. And so I think that in my time, I feel very fortunate that we've been a part of both I've been a part of the civil rights and rights movement in terms of the independence movement, and also still living to be a part of the movement for a reparatory justice, which is very different. I think what happened is our people right now is that, we put our ladder up on the wall and we have achieved those window dressing things. And we got to the top of the ladder, and we even have in the United States a Black man as a president, as part of that. We see the kinds of ways in which we've achieved things here in Canada. We're talking about Canada. We have Black senators. We have, Black MLAs. We have, Black professors. We have all these things. We put our ladder against the wall of the Western standards of success. And now we're stopping. We're saying we got to the highest rung. And now that we're at the highest rung, we've decided that our ladder is against the wrong wall. We need to take that ladder down and put it against another wall, a wall that is more equitable, a wall that is more humane, a wall, and Isaac articulated it so well, I can't do better, in terms of what reparations is really about. It's about humanizing us, making us a human family, and it goes back to the principles of Ubuntu,
Okay. So
of what we're trying to do.
I have some questions. I want us to get to some of the questions. Otherwise, we will just have a discussion amongst ourselves.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Was there any, just very quick, Isaac?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, like, this idea about transforming relations, there's an international dimension that's often been forgotten. And it was a third world project that emerged in 1959 in Bandung, right? And then crystallized in the demand for a new international economic order, right? That came out in the 1970s. And African countries played a very significant role in that, and Caribbean countries. And this was about transforming in a limited way, but what would be in a very important way, right? The ideas of how the international economy should have worked. That was defeated and rejected by the West, right? And so I think I see that as part of the reparations movement, perhaps not articulated as a reparations movement, but part of that. The idea that we need to restructure relations between countries, relations within countries, and even relations between human beings.
Okay, fantastic. We have a question from Charles Brand Mintus. What government body will control or govern the definition, distribution, and identification of African Nova Scotians to be awarded reparations?
Yeah. I'll jump on that. I think that thank you for that question, Charles. We, as an African people in Canada, we have to control the definition. which is this conversation is part of that early work. I hope people will look back and say that this is part of it. The work that Global African Congress is doing is part of defining what reparations means. But when we say, what will be the body to award reparations, it's not something that's going to be awarded to us, because that again is taking us back to the definition where there's going to be that is transactional, that we're going to be given something, and it's bigger than that, as my colleagues here have said. Even like when we look at some of the things that we're doing right now in terms of redressing issues in the education system, the healthcare system, the new justice center that's going to be established in Nova Scotia. Some of the various funds that have come up after the COVID-19 crisis, and a lot of the work that's happening around anti-Black racism, and creating these entities that are going to deal with these very important issues for helping us to be better humans and better versions of ourselves. These are all reparations as well. So it is not the exchange of a check to each person. It's not that going to be that simple where people are going to sit around and figure who gets this and who gets that. It's not that kind of a way. So I would just end by saying it's an excellent question, because what it does, it exposes very much how many of us, not saying that this is what I know this particular person, I know that this person thinks bigger than that. I know this is a question to get us to say that for others to hear. That absolutely, this is a way in which we will not sort of keep it to that lower level of thinking that the government will be able to cut us a check and walk away. We're going to be integrated throughout the entire Canadian economy, political system, cultural system, and not only that, we will work to change it to such a way that it benefits every Canadian, not just Black people, but all of us. So we're starting a new conversation about humanity.
Right. Okay. So, I think Isaac kind of alluded to that. Maybe what I would like to recommend, because of the time, is that maybe we'll get one person to answer a question. I'll give the feedback, and then if we have time later on, then we could see how we're doing this. Right. So we have a question from Dr. Pemberton Cyrus. Can you explain how a realignment of society will achieve reparations while benefiting all players? And I did ask what he meant by players, and he said essentially it had to do with, let me just find what he said, all players, like all the stakeholders, descendants of slave owners, slaves, and immigrants. So how will it benefit while benefiting all the various stakeholders or players? So Isaac or Sakaya, you want to chime in on that question?
I've always noticed that whenever African people struggle, or wherever we struggle for justice, everybody else benefits. Every single soul benefit from our struggle. It's not the other way around. We don't normally benefit from other people's struggle in a very large sense, but we do. So when we talk about realignment of society, yes, it's a realignment for a more just society. It's a better society. It's a more humane society. It advances our humanity. I think Isaac alluded to the fact that we need to look at the present construction of structural inequality and what it does to us, what it does to humanity. How do we develop a society that is harmonious with each other, harmonious with the environment, protect the future? How do we do that? So I think reparation will allow us, as we begin to embark on the new construction of a new society, all of these fitting pieces are the missing pieces. We would be looking at what are the main contradictions now and how it's not in keeping with our best interest. Clearly, we will be able to look at those things and put in place mechanism to address those structural and systemic problems. So I think society will be a better place for all of us, for all of humanity.
Yeah. And if I may add to that, I think it's important to understand that people often say, okay, where is the money going to come from, right? Where are we going to find the resources? If people take a strict economically through that concept of reparations. But when we look at the wealth that Jeff Bezos, right, and Elon Musk have made, right, like during this pandemic, something like the richest people on the planet have increased their wealth by 1.9 trillion, right, and the bottom of society, right, now the 50 have decreased their wealth by over 1 trillion as well. There's more than enough wealth to go around, right? We know that it's a question of distribution, right? The idea that there's scarce resources is an argument that's used to justify the concentration and the transfer of wealth to the ever-increasing rich. And we know, as Sakai's pointed out, when the envelope of Black freedom expands, it expands for everybody. Okay, like we know when Black wages go up, white wages go up, as a simple example, right? So I think that, and I have a feeling, and I may be wrong, that when reparations comes, right, okay, in the way we see it, it will come when society is going through its transformation, right? And I think one of the interesting things, and I think how people saw this, and I think where people have this intuitive understanding that Black liberation necessarily encompasses their liberation, was in the mass demonstrations that took place after George Floyd's killing on May 25th. It was Black-led. They were the largest mass movements in North American history, largest in U.S. history, and I think among the largest in Canadian history. They were Black-led, but they were multiracial, multi-ethnic, and multi-generational. And there were a lot of young people, young white folks, right, okay, who participated in that, who understand that Black oppression, Black disenfranchisement, exploitation, and marginalization is also at the core of many of the issues that sort of, in many cases, deform and fetter their own lives.
Right.
Just a quick comment, Harvey. Just a quick comment, because I just have to say that the old people used to always say, I mean, in answer to the question about how it will benefit all players, the old folk used to say, pardon the expression, the world is going to hell in a handbasket. And it's a very true thing when you look at what's happening in terms of the environment, sustainability, these kinds of issues, and who's having real conversations. And Isaac, you took words from my mouth and head when I watched people standing there clapping about these little space launches and thinking, that having space tourism is something that's going to be beneficial to us as a human species. Can't see it. And honestly, other than the environmental movement of young people there, and recently the Occupy movement that happened a few years back, where people are talking about, the just, absurd wealth. There aren't many global movements that are really fighting for the humanization and for saving humankind. And Black people, African people, were often the canary in the mine when because we're at the bottom of the economic totem path. We know very well that when our conditions change, because we are having those real conversations, that other people's conditions will change also. So I see that reparatory justice is having a different conversation than many of the other conversations that are happening in the world. And it's one of rescuing humanity. And I really feel that this has always been true, even in the civil rights movement as well. We saw how everybody who were also feeling these things came on board in terms of the gender justice, poverty, war. People come on board. Once again, here we are leading a conversation about rescuing humanity from its own ill vices towards self-destruction.
Right. And I can't remember who it was who said this, that essentially Black people are the ones who will humanize the world. I don't know if it was Malefi or I'm trying to remember, but it was someone who, in a presentation I heard several years ago, who made that particular comment. And in reality, when we fight for social justice in any quadrant, everyone benefits. When we talk about the importance of diversity and inclusion, when we make these institutions more inclusive, well, it is only if you see your life in terms of a zero-sum game that you actually believe that way. If you actually see it where equality and equity actually should be what we should be aspiring towards, and that when we get there, we actually, all of us would benefit. I think it's just that some people are just not convinced because they operate from a mindset that basically say that the pie is round, and to give Black people any opportunities means that it has to take away from mine. So I think we have to kind of really work on that particular mindset. We have a question here from the US. Kwame Watkins asked the question, which level of government should be petitioned for reparations to garner maximum results? Local, provincial, national, regional, such as the OAS, international. And I know Sakaya, as the president of the Global African Congress, you are talking to governments, you're talking to some very important people, even the ambassador to CARICOM, right here, Barbados ambassador to CARICOM, who is only probably a couple arms lengths away from you physically right now. Let's start off with you on this one.
I think we have to look at who was involved in the enslavement, the slave trade and enslavement of African people in European countries. And we have to talk about all the institutions. The slave trade was a very well-defined, organized business. It was backed up by government, it was backed up by military, it was backed up by institution. So if you think of, so for example, when Britain entered the slave trade, because at the time it was competing against the other European countries, be it Spain or France, what did the United Kingdom did? They threw all of their resources, including the resources from the royal family. A British company, the Royal African Company, was organized with some of the most powerful people inside of the United Kingdom, in England at the time, becoming part of the board of directors. Like, for example, John Locke, the man who was the #1 philosopher of social justice at the time, with all of his knowledge and exporting social justice, he saw no contradiction between justice and denying African the humanity. So reparation, we have to hold every single one of those government, the institution, enterprise, the business accountable. They are accountable. Think of a guy like David Cameron, his grandfather. His grandfather was a slave owner. And he would want to go to a country like Jamaica to tell Jamaica that, look, it was in the past, but you should forget about this for asking for reparations. So it's a large amount of entity. I was in Trinidad a few years ago, and I was scouting around in the library, and I came across a serious speech Eric Williams made, for example, and I saw where Eric Williams was doing some research, and this one Englishman who left England, and in 20 years he was a multi-billionaire. And he invests in Canadian railways, he invests in Canadian marine industry, both Canada and Australian industry. No, we have to go and do those research and find out all of those institutions that benefit from the enslavement of African people and demand reparation from them. So in other words, what I'm saying, there's not one single entity, but a multitude of entities that built and benefit from the enslavement of African people, and they should be held accountable.
Right. So, Kai, that begs the question of how we coordinate and the advocacy, the level of advocacy that is necessary to hit all these multiple fronts.
A beautiful initiative is on its way right now. A very beautiful initiative, and yes, I think perhaps David would best to speak about that. But I could share with you that the African Union and CARICOM will be meeting for the first time. Just imagine, after almost 60 years of political independence, the heads of government in Africa and the Caribbean have not really had a formal meeting. And one specific issue on that agenda will be reparation. We know from our advocacy, from the Global African Congress advocacy, I could share with you that some years ago, I tell the story all the time, and it seems funny, but I was just playing around. I was in the office one day, and I was busy. I saw something in the press that the Church of England held slave at a plantation in Barbados. And I went on my computer and I wrote a letter to the Archbishop of Canterbury. And I said, what I did in writing a letter to him, I said, wait a minute, why am I just doing this and just asking for reparation? What would reparation look like? And so I went to the University of Toronto, and I asked a whole series of issues. One of them was I wanted to find out how much it costs to build all the building. I couldn't get that information, but I was able to get information and the UFT budget per year. So then I put a proposal to the Archbishop of Canterbury. I said, I want you to build a similar university with X amount of students from right across the diaspora, all language groups from the continent, a whole bunch of faculty. And I really was joking. I said about a whole bunch of faculty. And I said, we want you to finance this for the next 125 years. And he wrote me back and said, with whom I negotiate. Honestly, I still have that letter. He says, with whom I negotiate. Well, of course, that's the time I recognized that perhaps the Caribbean was best in a position to access reparation in a fundamental way. And that was the time I started to write the letter campaign very seriously, pushing the Caribbean government to form the Reparation Commission. So it's what I'm saying, it's doable. There are multiple institutions for the Caribbean and Africa. That's a good start. In Canada, we have to form ourselves in an organized, a much better organized way. We have enough intelligence among ourselves to work out our difference and to develop a strategic plan, how it will benefit the various communities. What do we want in terms of what reparation should look like? I'm sure the reparation in Nova Scotia might be very well different from Windsor, Ontario. There might be different programs. And so we're going to have to, there's a whole question of repair of ourselves. It's a more fundamental issue that's going to call for a whole range of expertise and resources. That must be a must. So in terms of a program, it's a multiple layer of institution and individuals, and that has to be at the table.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Before I let Sensei go, I shouldn't say Sensei. That's not a word from us. I'm going to say my Pa'at, my teacher, Dr. Saini. Very quickly on that point, someone who was very influential in my life here, not famous but influential. Reverend Trevor Phillips, his name was, and he was originally from Jamaica. He always used to say, when you're trying to solve a problem of magnitude for ourselves, we have to fire on all cylinders. So I truly believe that when we're talking about reparatory justice in the Canadian context, we do have to look at every level of government. Mm-hmm. And charity does often begin at home. I think that even amongst our various provinces, we could have many reparations commissions at the provincial level. Some provinces will probably, based on the population, like Nova Scotia and Ontario and Quebec, and the long-rooted history, will have stronger ones, but that will still elevate all of us nationally. So I think we could start at that level and then fanning it out nationally to go straight head-to-head with the federal government on what their role would be. And I agree with Sakaya. I mean, one of the challenges we have in Canada, we are not a nation. Our economic and our life, we are like a nation within a nation in a certain way culturally, but we're not a nation in the sense, the way that, the CARICOM can have bilateral negotiations and conversations with England and France and the European countries that were slave owners and slave holders. We don't have a nation. We are sort of that sixth division, as we call it in the Global African Congress, those of us in the diaspora. So I think that we could do that. And the other thing to keep in mind is Canada being such an affluent country, if we here, through the work of the Global African Congress, through the leadership of people like Sakaya, can really organize ourselves here. And we're kind of behind when I look at, having been to international reparations conferences with Sakaya, we could be doing much better to organize ourselves in Canada. And us being such an affluent country, we could have a very loud voice in terms of the international movement, in terms of what Canada could bring to the table with all the resources that Canada has to be able to affect change when we get to the level of things like the UN.
Yeah. I think that
you get the last word because we are over. We are now 8 minutes over our 90-minute president.
Yeah, I'd like to say I think there's a dialectical link between the stuff that the measures you've mentioned, Delvino, organizing the African Canadian community, organizing different commissions, and the international level. Canada specifically, as a country that likes to position itself as a middle power, to have influence on the world stage is very sensitive to international criticism, right? So, for example, when the report on the working group of experts and people of African descent on its mission to Canada, the United Nations report came out, it was very sensitive to that. Canada is very sensitive to where it places in the annual UN Human Development reports, right? And remember the case, for example, that was brought on Indigenous rights. I think it was Viola Robinson, if I remember correctly, right? On those rights was brought at the United Nations, right? So Canada is very sensitive to these international pressures. We know that Trudeau tried very hard to get a seat at the UN Security Council and was derailed, right? So as the CARICOM and the African Union cooperate, as the call for reparations gains international support across the world, right? As these cases go forward, right? And for example, even though it was very limited in terms of the German so-called compensation to the Herero and Nama people, right? These things add pressure against Canada. The United States, for example, always tries to be inert and pretend and does actually, we don't care what the international community does, right? Okay, that's the nature of the imperial power. Canada is very sensitive, right? And I think a combination of organizing ourselves within Canada together with this burgeoning international movement and calls from international bodies, I think will help to put pressure on Canada, right? We've seen some of these cosmetic changes that have taken place. And I don't want to, patronize them by saying they're only cosmetics, but they're necessary, but not sufficient in and of themselves, because they don't go to transforming the fundamental conditions that we live in. But I think we're at a movement. And as you pointed out, this is the beginning of a conversation. And we just need, as Stokely Carmichael, who became Kwame Ture, said, we have to organize.
Right.
And one final.
No, I'm going to give everybody 30 seconds to just wrap up. So your 30 seconds starts now, Sakaya.
Okay, there's a distinct advantage that we have in Canada. And I discovered this while at work, we were developing the Black Ontario Public Service Network. It took me a while to discover that we had members in that organization from every single Caribbean country and many Spanish-speaking country. More importantly, we have members from just about every single African country. So Canada is a hub. It's an opportunity, it's a unique opportunity we have in terms of a global movement, because many people from the continent, from the Caribbean, they're here, they're Canadian, but they still have ties at home. And this could feed right into a global movement. So I think we should take advantage of that to advance the reparations struggle, the global movement for reparation.
You have another 30 seconds.
Okay. I'll end by saying...
Bring back to defining reparations in the Canadian context. 30 seconds.
Well, I'm just going to say a parting word, which is that I just think that if Canadians, whether Nova Scotia or elsewhere, if we truly embrace reparatory justice as the pipeline to prosperity, and by prosperity I mean an evolved consciousness, an evolved humanity, we must be prepared to adopt an Afrocentric philosophical framework, a Pan-Africanist philosophical framework, reclaim the things that Garvey taught us, reclaim the things that Dr. Asante through Afrocentricity has taught us. We must be prepared to adopt these philosophical frameworks in every aspect of any kind of reparatory justice claim that we should make.
Fantastic. Isaac, 30 seconds.
I just reiterate that, we need to organize provincially, we need to organize nationally, and we need to organize internationally. We're part of a global movement, a Pan-African movement, and we're part of a human movement to transform the world. As Frantz Fanon once said, each generation either finds its mission, discovers its mission, or betrays it, right? And Mumia Abu-Jamal said, our goal is to transform the dull realities that we live in. So that's the only way we can have optimism to actually have a better future.
All right, good. Thank you very much. And if I may use my privilege to just say one point, which is that in order to sort of galvanize all of us in the reparations movement, I think it's important for us not to see it as a movement that belongs to the descendants of enslaved Africans, but that in fact by impacting descendants of enslaved Africans, or if we are Pan-Africanists and we embrace the African family as a single family, then what happened to enslaved Africans also happened to people who do not consider themselves having being or people who do not see themselves as descendants of enslaved Africans. The reality is that we're one big family, and what happens to my family in Brazil is my history. What happens to my family in the US is my history. What happens to my family on the continent is my history. But to be able to come together, Sakaya, when you were saying that, you know, you have all these in the diaspora that's kind of fractured, but it has to come together so that we all advocate together for reparations. We have to see beyond just repayment for the atrocities that were meted out to enslaved Africans and their descendants. We have to see it as what happened to the African family, and all of us have to participate in advocating for reparations, because the benefits go beyond a paycheck. They go beyond all the things we talk. They include all the things we talk about in terms of our human dignity, humanizing the world, creating an environment that we could all live in peace and justice and harmony and all those sorts of things. We all benefit from that, and therefore we all have a stake in fighting for reparations for all Africans. All right. So thank you to all the folks who stayed on with us. We've had a nice solid group of folks online that have been with us for the last hour and a half. You guys have shared some phenomenal pieces of information, a wealth of history and perspectives on the issue of reparations. The conversation obviously is continuing. The echoes are getting louder, and then we're beginning to see movements from around the globe that will sort of crescendo into something that is very powerful and very forceful. So the Afrocentric Learning Institute and Afrocentricity International thanks each and every one of you for your participation tonight, your contribution, and for enlightening us about the issue of reparations in a Canadian context. I'm Harvey Miller, and thank you all folks for joining, and thank you for being on the panel and being a part of this.
Good night, Isaac. Good night, Sakaya. Good night, guys. We'll be in touch. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. Okay, bye.
Bye, everyone, and bye, folks online. Thank you. And then the broadcasts will be available for people to watch on YouTube if they missed it. Thank you.